There is a moment when the room falls silent, when all eyes turn to you, waiting for your response, your defense, your explanation. The modern world has taught you to fill this space with words, to justify, to clarify, to perform the elaborate dance of verbal defense. But what if I told you that in that very moment of silence, you possess a power so profound that ancient philosophers built entire schools of thought around it? A power that the noise of our age has buried beneath layers of constant chatter and compulsive explanation. You have been conditioned to believe that silence is emptiness, that it signals weakness or ignorance. But the masters of antiquity knew something we have forgotten. They understood that in the space between stimulus and response lies the realm where true strength is forged. Not the strength of the loudest voice or the cleverest retort, but the strength of the unshakable mind that needs no audience for its truth. When someone attacks your character, when they question your motives, when they try to provoke you into the arena of their own chaos, the untrained soul rushes to respond. It feels the burn of injustice and mistakes, that burning for a call to action. But the initiated understand that this burning is not a signal to speak. It is a test of your sovereignty over your own inner kingdom. The silence that follows is not absence. It is presence in its most concentrated form. I have watched countless souls destroy themselves, not through what they refused to say, but through what they could not stop themselves from saying. The compulsion to respond, to correct, to defend becomes a prison more confining than any external circumstance. Each word spoken in reaction rather than reflection becomes a chain that binds you to the very person or situation you seek to escape. You become enslaved to their provocations, dancing to the rhythm they have set, speaking the words they have summoned from you. But there exists another way, a path walked by those who have learned to wield silence as both shield and sword. When you master the art of conscious non-response, you step outside the game entirely. You refuse to be drawn into the endless cycle of accusation and defense, of provocation and reaction. In your silence, something remarkable happens. The other person is left alone with their own projections, their own shadows, their own need to fill the void with increasingly desperate attempts to pull you back into their drama. This is not the silence of the defeated or the withdrawn. This is not the sulking quiet of the wounded or the cold shoulder of the passive-aggressive. This is the silence of the mountain that remains unmoved while storms rage around its peaks. It is the silence of the ocean depths that remains still while surface waves crash and foam. It is the silence of the wise who have learned that not every question deserves an answer, not every accusation merits a defense, and not every provocation requires a response. In this silence, you discover something extraordinary. You realize that most of the words you thought were necessary were actually compulsions born from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being judged, fear of not being seen as you wish to be seen. But when you cease the exhausting labor of managing other people's perceptions, when you stop trying to control how your silence is interpreted, you reclaim an enormous amount of energy that was previously scattered to the winds of other people's opinions. The silence I speak of is not empty. It is full. It is pregnant with possibility, heavy with presence, alive with awareness. When you choose silence in the face of provocation, you are not retreating. You are advancing into a territory that belongs entirely to you. You are claiming sovereignty over your own responses, your own energy, your own peace. You are declaring that your inner state is not subject to the whims and manipulations of others. But this practice reveals something else, something that cuts deeper than mere strategy or technique. When you consistently choose silence over reaction, you begin to see how much of your previous communication was not truly yours at all. How many of your words were borrowed from old wounds? How many of your responses were echoes of ancient hurts? How many of your defenses were automated programs running without conscious direction? The silence strips away these layers of conditioned response and reveals what remains when you are not performing, not explaining, not justifying. What remains is often startling in its simplicity. Beneath the noise of constant explanation lies a truth so clear it needs no defense. Beneath the compulsion to be understood lies a self so whole it requires no validation. Beneath the fear of being sieved lies a reality so solid it cannot be shaken by the opinions of others. The silence does not create this truth, it reveals it. It sweeps away the debris of endless chatter and exposes the bedrock of who you actually are. Yet the path of conscious silence is not without its challenges. The world will interpret your quiet in 1,000 different ways, most of them wrong. Some will call it arrogance, others will label it coldness. Some will see it as weakness, others as manipulation. The untrained mind will want to correct these misperceptions, to explain the deeper purpose, to defend the choice. But this very urge to clarify is where the practice deepens. Can you remain silent, even about your silence? Can you allow others their interpretations without feeling compelled to correct them? This is where the true test begins. Because silence as a technique is one thing, but silence as a way of being is another entirely. When you no longer need to explain your silence, when you no longer feel the itch to justify your choice not to engage, when you can watch others project their own fears and assumptions onto your quiet presence without feeling moved to respond, then you have touched something ancient and powerful. The masters understood that words are like arrows. Once released, they cannot be recalled. But silence is like the bow itself. It remains in your possession, ready to be drawn or left at rest, according to your will alone. In a world drunk on expression, the one who has mastered restraint possesses a clarity that cuts through illusion like light through darkness. They see what others miss because they are not busy formulating responses. They hear what others cannot because they are not preparing their next argument. But perhaps most importantly, they discover that silence is not the absence of communication. It is communication in its purest form. When you stop filling every pause with explanation, when you cease the endless project of making yourself understood, something profound happens in the space between you and others. Your presence begins to speak louder than your words ever could. Your stillness becomes more. Your peace becomes more powerful than any movementing, than any argument. This is the paradox that the ancient wise ones discovered. By saying less, you communicate more. By defending nothing, you become unassailable. By explaining yourself to no one, you become clear to everyone who matters. The silence becomes a mirror in which others see not your weakness, but their own need to fill every void with noise. It becomes a test that reveals not your limitations, but their own discomfort with depth, with mystery, with the profound power of someone who needs nothing from them. And in that revelation lies the beginning of true freedom, not just for you, but for them as well. There is a deeper current running beneath this practice, one that the surface mind rarely glimpses. When you consistently choose the path of conscious silence, you begin to encounter forces within yourself that have remained hidden beneath the constant chatter of explanation and defense. These are not comfortable discoveries. In the stillness that follows your refusal to react, you will meet parts of yourself that have been feeding on the drama of engagement, parts that have grown fat on the energy of conflict and justification. You will discover, perhaps to your horror, that some aspect of you actually enjoys the fight. There is a shadow within that feels alive when provoked, that finds meaning in being misunderstood, that derives a perverse satisfaction from being the victim of others' projections. This shadow has been using your words as weapons, your explanations as shields, your defenses as a way to remain perpetually engaged in battles that serve no one. When you withdraw into silence, this shadow starves. And a starving shadow does not go quietly into the night. It will whisper to you in the moments when silence feels most difficult. It will tell you that your quiet is being misinterpreted, that your reputation is at stake, that your relationships will suffer if you do not speak. It will conjure elaborate scenarios of what others are thinking, what they are saying behind your back, how your silence is being weaponized against you. This is the voice that has kept you enslaved to the reactions of others. The voice that insists you must always be performing the elaborate theater of self-justification. But here is where the practice becomes alchemical. Instead of being seduced back into speech by these internal provocations, you learn to apply the same principle inward. You become silent even to the voices within that demand explanation. You refuse to engage even with your own compulsions to defend and justify. This internal silence is far more challenging than external quiet, for it requires you to witness the machinations of your own psyche without being moved by them. In this deeper silence, you encounter what the ancients called the witness, that part of you that observes without judgment, that sees without needing to fix, that knows without needing to prove. This witness has been present all along, but it has been drowned out by the constant noise of reaction and response. When you stop feeding the reactive patterns, when you cease the endless internal commentary about what others are thinking or feeling, the witness emerges naturally. From this place of witnessing, you begin to see the intricate web of unconscious agreements that govern most human interaction. You see how people use words not to communicate, but to manipulate, not to express truth, but to manage perception. You see how conversations become elaborate dances of projection and assumption, where no one is actually listening, but everyone is preparing their next move. You see how much of what passes for dialogue is actually parallel monologues, ships passing in the night of mutual misunderstanding. And you see something else, how your own participation in this web has been unconscious, how your own words have often been attempts to control rather than communicate, to manage others' responses rather than express your truth. This seeing is not comfortable. It strips away the noble stories you have told yourself about your intentions, about your desire to be understood, about your need to set the record straight. It reveals the subtle manipulations hidden within seemingly innocent explanations. This revelation could lead to despair, to a cynical withdrawal from all human connection. But for those who persist in the practice, something different emerges. A compassion born not of pity, but of recognition. You begin to see that others are trapped in the same web of unconscious reaction that once held you. Their provocations are not personal attacks, but desperate attempts to break free from their own internal prisons. Their need to make you respond is not cruelty, but a cry for connection that they do not know how to make directly. From this understanding comes a different quality of silence. No longer cold or defensive, it becomes warm with presence. No longer empty or withdrawn, it becomes full with awareness. You learn to be silent, not as a weapon against others, but as a gift to them, the gift of space in which they can encounter themselves without your interference. Your silence becomes a sanctuary in which their own truth can emerge, unobstructed by your reactions or responses. This is when silence reveals its deepest power. It becomes not just a personal practice, but a way of serving others. When you refuse to take the bait of provocation, you force others to confront their own motivations. When you do not fill every pause with explanation, you create space for deeper communication to emerge. When you stop managing others' perceptions of you, you free them to see you as you actually are, rather than as their projections demand you to be. But this service comes with a price. You must be willing to be misunderstood, perhaps permanently. You must be willing to let others think what they will without rushing to correct them. You must be willing to stand in your truth, even when that truth is invisible to those around you. This requires a kind of spiritual maturity that our culture rarely teaches, the ability to know yourself so deeply that external validation becomes unnecessary. The silence begins to reshape not just your responses, but your entire relationship with reality. You stop trying to convince the world of anything. You stop needing others to see things your way. You stop measuring your worth by how well you can explain yourself or how successfully you can defend your position. Instead, you begin to live from an internal reference point that needs no external confirmation. This is where the practice transcends technique and becomes a way of being. The silence is no longer something you do, it becomes something you are. Not the absence of speech, but the presence of something so complete it requires no expression. Not the withholding of words, but the fullness of being that makes most words unnecessary. In this fullness, you discover that silence has its own language, its own way of speaking truth. A glance can say more than a paragraph. A presence can communicate more than a speech. A quality of attention can heal what no words could mend. You learn to speak this language fluently, to communicate in the spaces between words, to touch others' souls without making a sound. And paradoxically, when you finally do choose to speak, your words carry a weight they never possessed before. They come not from reaction, but from response, not from compulsion, but from choice. They arise from the depths of silence and return to silence, like waves emerging from the ocean and dissolving back into it. These words have power because they are chosen rather than automatic, because they serve truth rather than ego, because they emerge from stillness rather than agitation. The world begins to respond differently to someone who speaks from this place. Others sense, perhaps unconsciously, that your words are not weapons or shields, but offerings. They feel the absence of hidden agendas, the lack of manipulation, the presence of something authentic. Even when they disagree with what you say, they cannot dismiss the way you say it. Even when they resist your message, they are drawn to your messenger. This is the ultimate paradox of the path. By learning to be comfortable with being misunderstood, you become more deeply understood than ever before. By ceasing to defend yourself, you become truly defensible. By stopping the endless project of explanation, you become genuinely clear. The silence that once seemed like retreat reveals itself as the deepest form of engagement with reality, rather than with the stories people tell about reality. Yet as you walk deeper into this territory of conscious silence, you will encounter resistances that test the very foundation of your resolve. The world around you operates on the assumption that silence equals consent, that non-response indicates agreement or defeat. You will face situations where your refusal to engage will be interpreted as admission of guilt, where your quiet presence will be taken as weakness, where your stillness will be mistaken for emptiness. These moments are not obstacles to the practice. They are the practice itself. The untrained mind believes that silence must be explained, that others must understand why you choose not to respond. But this very need to justify your silence reveals how deeply you remain enslaved to external validation. True silence requires no explanation because it emerges from a place beyond the reach of others' interpretations. When you find yourself wanting to clarify your reasons for not speaking, you have not yet touched the depths of the practice. You are still performing silence rather than inhabiting it. There comes a moment in this journey when you realize that most of what you once considered necessary communication was actually a form of spiritual noise pollution. Your words were not serving truth, but feeding the collective trance of endless explanation and counter-explanation that keeps humanity trapped in surface reality. Each time you chose to respond to provocation, each time you felt compelled to set the record straight, each time you explained your position to someone who had no genuine interest in understanding it, you were participating in a vast conspiracy against depth. This recognition can be devastating. You begin to see how much of your life energy has been spent in the futile project of making yourself understood by those who were never truly listening. You see how many relationships were built on the quicksand of mutual explanation rather than the bedrock of mutual presence. You see how much of what you called connection was actually a sophisticated form of mutual manipulation, where each person tried to manage the other's responses through carefully crafted words. But in this devastation lies liberation. When you stop trying to control how others perceive you through your words, when you cease the exhausting labor of managing your image through explanation, when you abandon the impossible project of being understood by everyone, you discover something extraordinary. You find that the people who truly matter, the souls who resonate with your deeper truth, do not need your explanations. They sense something in your silence that speaks louder than any words could. They are drawn not to your ability to articulate, but to your capacity to be. The practice begins to reveal its deeper layers. You learn that there are different qualities of silence, different depths and textures and purposes. There is the silence of listening, which creates space for others to speak their truth. There is the silence of presence, which offers being rather than doing. There is the silence of power, which refuses to be drawn into games that serve no one. There is the silence of mystery, which preserves the sacred from the profane. There is the silence of love, which knows that sometimes the greatest gift is to say nothing at all. Each of these silences requires different muscles, different forms of strength. The silence of listening demands that you empty yourself of your own agenda to make room for another's experience. The silence of presence asks you to be so completely here that your being becomes a sanctuary for others. The silence of power requires you to know your worth so deeply that you need no external confirmation. The silence of mystery asks you to be comfortable with not being fully known. The silence of love demands that you trust the intelligence of the heart over the compulsions of the mind. As you develop fluency in these various forms of silence, you begin to see how much of human suffering stems from the inability to be quiet. The endless chatter of explanation and justification, the compulsive need to fill every pause with words, the terror of empty space in conversation. All of this emerges from a deep fear of encountering what lies beneath the surface of personality. The noise is not just external, it is internal. The mind has become addicted to its own commentary, its endless analysis and interpretation of experience. When you learn to be silent externally, you create the conditions for internal silence to emerge. But this internal quiet is not easily achieved. The mind will resist with every weapon in its arsenal. It will tell you that silence is dangerous, that you need to stay vigilant, that something terrible will happen if you stop thinking about everything. It will create elaborate scenarios to justify its own noise, problems that need solving, relationships that need managing, futures that need planning. This is where the practice becomes truly profound. You must learn to be silent, not just with others, but with the voice in your own head that insists on constant commentary. You must discover the space between thoughts, the pause between one mental movement and the next. In this space, something remarkable happens. You encounter the source from which both thoughts and silence emerge, the awareness that observes but is not disturbed by what it observes. From this place of pure awareness, silence is no longer a technique you employ, but your natural state. Words, when they come, arise spontaneously from this silence and return to it naturally. They are not born from compulsion, but from response, not from fear, but from love, not from the need to defend, but from the desire to serve. These words carry a different quality entirely. They land in others' consciousness, not as intrusions, but as invitations, not as weapons, but as medicine. But perhaps the most profound discovery in this journey is that silence is not the opposite of speech. but its source. True words emerge from silence the way flowers emerge from soil, naturally, beautifully, in their own timing. When you speak from this place, your words carry the authority of silence behind them. They resonate in the depths of others' being because they arise from the depths of your own. They heal because they emerge from wholeness. They illuminate because they arise from clarity. This is why the masters of old spoke so little, and yet their words echo through centuries. Their speech emerged from such profound silence that it carried the weight of eternity. They had learned to listen so deeply to the silence within that when they finally spoke, they were giving voice not to personal opinion, but to universal truth. Their words were not additions to the world's noise, but clarifications of what was already present, but unspoken. You begin to understand that the power of silence lies not in what it withholds, but in what it reveals. When you stop covering reality with the blanket of constant explanation, when you cease the endless project of interpretation and analysis, when you allow experience to be what it is without immediately converting it into words, something emerges that was always present but hidden. The truth that needs no defense because it is self-evident. The love that requires no declaration because it is felt. The wisdom that needs no expression because it radiates naturally from being. This is the secret the ancient philosophers guarded so carefully. They understood that silence is not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but presence, not weakness, but the ultimate strength. They knew that the one who masters silence masters life itself, because silence is the ground from which all experience arises and to which it returns. In learning to be comfortable with silence, you learn to be comfortable with existence itself in all its mystery and depth. The world will continue to misunderstand this practice. It will interpret your silence as many things it is not. But this misunderstanding is not your concern. Your concern is with the truth that emerges when you stop trying to manage others' perceptions, when you cease the endless labor of explanation, when you allow yourself to be known not through your words, but through your being. In that allowing, something sacred is born, not just in you, but in the space between you and others, in the field of consciousness that connects all things. This is where silence reveals its deepest gift. It shows you that you are not separate from others, not isolated in your own experience, not dependent on words to create connection. The silence that emerges from true understanding is not a wall, but a bridge, not a barrier, but an opening, not an ending, but a beginning of communication so profound that words become unnecessary ornaments on the deeper truth of shared being. And yet, as you descend deeper into this territory of conscious silence, you will encounter something that the surface teachings never warn you about: the terrible loneliness of the initiated. When you stop participating in the collective dance of explanation and reaction, when you cease to feed the machinery of mutual projection that most people mistake for relationship, you discover that very few souls are prepared to meet you in the depths where silence lives. The world operates on a different frequency entirely. It thrives on the constant exchange of noise, the endless ping and pong of accusation and defense, the familiar rhythm of drama and resolution. When you withdraw from this game, when you refuse to play your assigned role in others' psychological theaters, something profound happens. You become invisible to those who only know how to see through the lens of reaction. This invisibility is not metaphorical, it is experiential. You will sit in rooms full of people and feel as though you are watching from another dimension. Conversations will swirl around you like storms around a mountain peak, touching everything except the stillness at your center. Others will speak to you as if you are still the person who used to dance to their provocations, not realizing that someone entirely different now inhabits your form. The temptation to break this isolation, to return to the familiar patterns of engagement, becomes almost overwhelming. There is a comfort in being misunderstood in familiar ways, a strange warmth in the chaos of constant explanation. The silence, by contrast, can feel cold and empty, like wandering through a landscape that no one else can see. Your old self whispers seductively about the connections you are losing, the relationships that are withering in the absence of your participation in their dramas. But this is where the practice reveals its most profound test. Can you remain silent, even when silence costs you everything you once thought you needed? Can you preserve the integrity of your inner state, even when it means losing the approval of those who only knew how to love the version of you that explained itself into exhaustion? This is not a question that can be answered intellectually. It is a crucible that must be walked through with each cell of your being. The silence begins to strip away not just your compulsive speech, but the very foundations upon which you built your sense of self. You realize how much of your identity was constructed from the feedback loops of explanation and response, how much of who you thought you were existed only in the mirrors of others' reactions. When those mirrors go dark, when others can no longer see you through the familiar patterns of verbal engagement, you are forced to encounter the terrifying question: who are you when no one is watching, when no one is listening, when no one needs you to explain yourself? This question cannot be answered with words. It can only be lived into, breathed into, allowed to dissolve you completely until what remains is so fundamental that it needs no explanation. But the journey to this dissolution is not peaceful. It is a kind of death. The death of the persona that lived for external validation, the death of the self that existed only in relationship to others' perceptions, the death of the identity that required constant maintenance through speech. In this dying, you discover something that changes everything. The silence is not empty. It is pregnant with possibility. The space that opens when you stop filling it with explanations is not void. It is alive with presence. The loneliness that comes from no longer participating in the collective trance is not abandonment. It is homecoming to a self so complete it needs nothing from outside itself. But this discovery comes with its own burden. When you touch this place of complete self-sufficiency, when you taste the freedom that comes from needing nothing from others, you face another temptation, the seduction of spiritual superiority. The mind, ever clever, begins to construct new stories about your specialness, your enlightenment, your superiority to those still trapped in the web of endless explanation. This is perhaps the most dangerous pitfall on the path, for it turns the medicine of silence into the poison of spiritual pride. The true test of your practice becomes whether you can remain humble in your silence, whether you can refuse to engage without becoming arrogant about your refusal, whether you can be free from the need for validation without becoming cold to those who still desperately seek it. This requires a quality of compassion that few achieve, the ability to see others' compulsions without judgment, to witness their desperate attempts to be understood without feeling superior to their struggle. For in truth, every soul is seeking the same thing you have found in silence: a place of rest, a moment of being seen, an experience of being enough exactly as they are. Their words, their explanations, their desperate attempts to be understood are not evidence of their inferiority, but expressions of the same longing that drove you to this practice. They are simply using different methods to reach the same destination. This recognition transforms your silence from withdrawal into embrace. You learn to be quiet, not as a rejection of others, but as a gift to them. The gift of your presence uncluttered by the need to fix, explain, or manage their experience. Your silence becomes a sanctuary they can enter without having to perform, a space where they can rest from the exhausting labor of justifying their existence. But even this transformed silence is not the end of the journey. As you settle more deeply into this way of being, you begin to encounter forces that operate beyond the personal realm entirely. The silence connects you to currents of wisdom that flow beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. ancestral streams of knowing that speak in languages older than words. You begin to sense the presence of those who walked this path before you, not as historical figures, but as living influences in your field of awareness. The ancient philosophers who understood that true teaching happens in silence. The mystics who knew that the deepest truths cannot be spoken. The wise ones who discovered that the most powerful communication occurs in the spaces between words. Their silence echoes through time and finds resonance in your own. This connection to the deeper currents reveals another layer of the practice. Your silence is not just personal, it is archetypal. You are participating in something larger than your individual journey, something that serves the collective evolution of consciousness itself. Every moment you choose presence over reaction, every time you refuse to be drawn into the web of unconscious communication, every instance where you offer silence as medicine rather than withdrawal, you are contributing to a field of possibility that others can access. The silence becomes a form of service that requires no recognition, a way of teaching that needs no students, a method of healing that demands no credit. You discover that simply being truly present, simply refusing to add to the world's noise, simply existing from a place of inner completeness, creates ripples that extend far beyond your ability to measure or understand. Yet, as this understanding deepens, you face perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire journey, the recognition that even this noble purpose can become another form of ego attachment. The part of you that wants to be serving something greater, that finds meaning in being part of humanity's evolution, that derives satisfaction from being a silent teacher, even this must eventually be surrendered. The deepest silence is purposeless. It arises not because it serves something, but because it is the natural expression of what you have become, like a flower that blooms not to be beautiful, but because blooming is its nature, like a mountain that stands not to inspire, but because standing is its essence. Your silence eventually becomes simply what you are rather than what you do. This purposeless silence is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it strips away even the spiritual meaning you may have attached to your practice, leaving you with nothing to hold on to, no story to tell yourself about why your silence matters. Liberating because it frees you from the need to justify even your spiritual choices, releasing you into a spontaneity that flows from being itself rather than from any concept of what you should be. From this place, speech and silence become equal expressions of the same source. Words arise when they serve, fall away when they don't. Explanation emerges when it clarifies, dissolves when it obscures. The compulsion is gone completely, both the compulsion to speak and the compulsion to remain silent. What remains is pure responsiveness, the natural flow of expression that serves the moment without being enslaved to it. This is the mastery the ancients pointed toward, not the rigid control of never speaking, not the compulsive need to always explain, but the fluid wisdom that knows when words serve truth and when silence serves deeper. It is the freedom of the truly mature soul that can engage or withdraw, speak or remain quiet, explain or let mystery be, according to what love demands rather than what fear compels. In reaching this place, you discover that silence was never the goal. It was the doorway. Beyond that doorway lies a way of being that transcends all techniques, all practices, all methods. A way of being that is simultaneously empty and full, engaged and detached, speaking and silent. A way of being that needs nothing from the world because it has found everything within itself, yet gives everything to the world because it has nothing left to protect. This is where the journey of conscious silence ultimately leads, not to the achievement of some spiritual state, but to the dissolution of the one who was seeking that state. Not to the mastery of a technique, but to the recognition that what you were seeking through technique was always already present. Not to the power of silence over speech, but to the understanding that both arise from the same source and return to the same home. And in that understanding, the paradox resolves itself completely. You discover that you were never learning to be silent. You were learning to remember the silence that you always were beneath the noise of seeking. You were never developing the power to withhold words. You were uncovering the freedom that was always yours to express or not express according to the deepest wisdom of your being. The silence wins, not because it defeats speech, but because it reveals the space from which both silence and speech emerge. It wins not by conquering, but by embracing, not by rejecting, but by including, not by standing apart, but by standing at the very center of what is most true about existence itself. And from that center, whether you speak or remain silent, whether you explain or let mystery be, whether you engage or withdraw, you are always and already exactly where you need to be. The silence reveals its final secret only to those who have walked through all its chambers, who have tasted its loneliness and its fullness, its terror and its peace. This secret is not a teaching that can be transmitted through words. It is a recognition that dawns like light, breaking through clouds, sudden and complete and utterly transformative. You discover that the silence you have been cultivating, the practice you have been refining, the mastery you have been seeking, was never yours to begin with. It belongs to something far more ancient and vast than your personal journey, something that was using your individual path as its own expression. The silence that flows through you when you cease to speak from compulsion is the same silence that holds the space between stars, the same quietude that allows seeds to germinate in darkness, the same stillness that permits the heart to beat without conscious direction. This recognition dissolves the final boundary between practitioner and practice. You are not someone who chooses silence. You are silence choosing to express itself through the temporary form of your existence. The ego that once struggled with when to speak and when to remain quiet, that agonized over how its silence would be interpreted, that feared being misunderstood, dissolves into something infinitely more spacious and natural. From this dissolution emerges a way of being that cannot be taught, because it cannot be grasped. It is not a technique to be mastered, but a truth to be lived, not a skill to be developed, but a reality to be embodied. When someone provokes you now, when they demand explanation, or justification, or defense, your response arises from depths so profound that you yourself are often surprised by what emerges. Sometimes what comes is silence so complete it seems to stop time itself. Other times, words flow that carry such clarity they cut through confusion like light through fog. Sometimes you find yourself laughing at provocations that once would have triggered elaborate defenses. Other times, you respond with a presence so full it answers questions that were never actually asked in words. The key is that none of these responses are calculated. They do not emerge from strategies or techniques or remembered wisdom about the power of silence. They arise spontaneously from a place that knows without thinking, that responds without reacting, that acts without attachment to outcome. This is what the masters of old were pointing toward when they spoke of Wu Wei, action that arises from non-action, response that emerges from emptiness, engagement that flows from detachment. But here you encounter something that may disturb the spiritual seeker in you. This spontaneous responsiveness does not always look noble or enlightened. Sometimes it appears harsh to those who expected perpetual gentleness. Sometimes it seems cold to those who confused warmth with endless accommodation. Sometimes it looks selfish to those who mistook self-sacrifice for love. The response that arises from true silence serves truth rather than image, reality rather than expectation, what is needed rather than what is wanted. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the mature practice, allowing your responses to be guided by something deeper than your own ideas about how an awakened person should behave. The silence that has transformed you does not necessarily make you more palatable to others. It makes you more real. And reality is not always comfortable for those who prefer the familiar patterns of unconscious interaction. You may find yourself saying no to requests you once would have automatically accepted. You may discover yourself walking away from conversations that once would have hooked you completely. You may realize you are no longer available for the emotional labor that others have come to expect from you. These changes are not cruelty. They are clarity. They are not withdrawal. They are boundaries arising naturally from self-respect. The people in your life will respond to these changes in various ways. Some will be threatened by your new solidity, your refusal to be moved by their familiar manipulations. They may escalate their provocations, increase their demands for explanation, become more desperate in their attempts to pull you back into the old dance of reaction and counter-reaction. These responses are not personal attacks. They are the death throes of patterns that can no longer feed on your energy. Others will be drawn to the quality of presence that emerges from your practice. They will sense something in you that they hunger for, a peace that seems unshakable, a clarity that cuts through confusion, a strength that needs no demonstration. These souls will approach your silence not as a wall to be breached, but as a sanctuary to be entered. They will find in your presence permission to stop performing, to cease explaining, to rest in their own being. But perhaps most importantly, you will begin to attract others who are walking similar paths, souls who have also discovered the power that lives in the space between stimulus and response. These connections are unlike anything you experienced in your previous way of being. They are built not on the exchange of explanations, but on the sharing of presence, not on the management of perceptions, but on the meeting of authentic selves. With these kindred spirits, you discover forms of communication that transcend the verbal entirely. A glance carries volumes of understanding. A silence shared becomes a conversation deeper than any words could provide. The space between you becomes alive with recognition, with the joy of souls who have found their way home to themselves and can therefore truly meet each other. Yet even these connections do not become attachments in the old sense. The silence that has freed you from the compulsion to explain has also freed you from the need to possess or be possessed by others. You can love deeply without losing yourself, connect intimately without merging, care profoundly without becoming responsible for others' choices. This is love purified of need, relationship cleansed of compulsion, connection born of wholeness rather than emptiness. As this way of being stabilizes, you begin to notice how it affects the larger field of consciousness around you. Your silence becomes a tuning fork that helps others remember their own capacity for stillness. Your refusal to engage in unconscious patterns creates space for more conscious forms of interaction to emerge. Your presence begins to serve as a mirror in which others can see possibilities they had forgotten existed. This influence happens without effort or intention on your part. It is simply what occurs when someone embodies authentic presence in a world hungry for reality. Like a candle that illuminates simply by burning, like a spring that nourishes simply by flowing, your being begins to serve life in ways that require no recognition or reward. But the deepest transformation is the one that occurs within the very fabric of your relationship with existence itself. The silence that began as a practice, that developed into a way of being, finally reveals itself as the very ground of awareness from which all experience arises. You discover that you are not separate from this silence. You are this silence, temporarily taking form as a human being, temporarily engaging in the play of speech and response, temporarily participating in the dance of relationship and communication. This recognition brings with it a quality of humor that permeates everything. The seriousness with which you once approached the practice of silence the intensity with which you struggled with when to speak and when to remain quiet, the drama of being misunderstood, and the effort of trying to be seen. All of this begins to seem like an elaborate game that consciousness plays with itself. You can engage fully in this game without being imprisoned by it. Participate completely without losing yourself in the performance, whether others understand you or misinterpret you, whether they appreciate your silence or demand your words, whether they meet you in depth or remain on the surface. All of this becomes equally acceptable because none of it touches what you truly are. From this place of ultimate acceptance, a new form of engagement becomes possible. You can speak when speaking serves, remain silent when silence serves, explain when explanation clarifies, and let mystery be when mystery is what is needed. There is no compulsion in any direction, no attachment to any particular response, no investment in any specific outcome. This is the freedom that the ancient philosophers pointed toward, but could not directly transmit. It cannot be taught because it is not a technique. It cannot be learned because it is not knowledge. It cannot be achieved because it is not separate from what you already are. It can only be recognized, allowed, embodied, lived. And in this living, the paradox that began this entire journey resolves itself completely. Silence does not win over words because there was never really a battle. They are both expressions of the same source, both movements in the same dance, both faces of the same truth. The power of silence is not its ability to defeat speech, but its capacity to reveal the space from which both silence and speech emerge, the space that you are, have always been, and could never actually leave. In that space, every choice is perfect, every response is appropriate, every moment is complete exactly as it is. Whether you speak or remain silent, whether you explain or let others wonder, whether you engage or withdraw, you are always and only being what you are. Consciousness itself, playing in the fields of form, exploring the infinite possibilities of expression and non-expression, eternally free to choose, and eternally beyond the need to choose anything at all. This is the final teaching of silence, that there is nothing to achieve because everything is already accomplished, nothing to become because you already are what you seek, nothing to master because mastery implies separation from what is always already whole. The silence that seemed so difficult to maintain, that required such discipline to cultivate, that demanded such courage to embody, reveals itself to have been your natural state all along, temporarily obscured, but never actually lost, always available, but rarely recognized, closer than your own breath, yet vaster than the universe itself. And from this recognition flows a peace that surpasses understanding, a joy that needs no reason, a love that excludes nothing and no one. This is what was always waiting in the silence, not a technique or a power or a way to control your responses, but the remembering of what you are beyond all roles and reactions, beyond all speech and silence, beyond all seeking and finding. In that remembering, the journey completes itself exactly where it began, in the simple recognition that you are already whole, already free, already home. The silence that seemed to be a path to somewhere else reveals itself to have been pointing here all along, to this moment, this breath, this awareness that reads these words and recognizes itself in the space between them. And in this recognition, something profound shifts in the very foundation of your being. You realize that what you took to be a practice was actually an uncovering. What you thought was a discipline was actually a remembering. What seemed like a journey was actually a homecoming to what was never lost. The silence that appeared to be something you cultivated reveals itself as something that was cultivating you, using your apparent efforts as a means to dissolve the very one who thought they were making those efforts. This dissolution is not dramatic or mystical. It is as natural as water finding its level, as inevitable as gravity, as simple as breathing. The part of you that once struggled with when to speak and when to remain quiet simply ceases to exist as a problem, not because it has been solved, but because the one who experienced it as a problem has been absorbed into something so much larger that individual concerns become like waves dissolving back into the ocean from which they arose. Yet this absorption does not diminish your humanity. It fulfills it. You do not become less human, but more truly human. Not less engaged, but more authentically present. Not less responsive, but more genuinely available to what each moment actually requires. The silence that has claimed you does not make you absent from life, but profoundly available to it in ways that the chattering mind never could be. From this availability emerges responses that surprise even you with their appropriateness. You find yourself saying exactly what needs to be said without having planned it, remaining silent precisely when silence serves without calculating the effect, moving or staying still in perfect harmony with forces you cannot name but somehow trust completely. This is not the result of mastery, but of surrender, the complete yielding of personal will to something infinitely more intelligent than the individual mind. But surrender, you discover, is not passivity. It is the most dynamic state possible. Pure responsiveness unfiltered by agenda, complete availability unobstructed by preconception, total openness unconditioned by past experience. From this surrendered state, action arises that is both effortless and precise, both spontaneous and perfectly appropriate, both natural and mysteriously guided. The people who encounter you in this state often cannot articulate what is different about your presence, but they feel it immediately. Some are comforted by it, sensing in your stillness a refuge from the storm of their own mental noise. Others are disturbed by it, feeling exposed by your clarity in ways that make them uncomfortable. Still others are inspired by it, recognizing in your peace a possibility they had forgotten existed within themselves. But your response to these various reactions remains consistent. You are equally present to all of them without being moved by any of them. The approval does not inflate you. The discomfort does not concern you. The inspiration does not make you feel special. You have become like space itself, available to contain whatever arises without being altered by its contents, capable of holding all experiences without being defined by any of them. This spatial quality of consciousness reveals another dimension of what you have become. The silence that lives through you is not personal. It is the silence of the cosmos itself, the pregnant emptiness from which all possibilities emerge and to which they return. You are no longer someone who practices silence, but someone through whom silence experiences itself. No longer a being who chooses not to speak, but a portal through which the unspoken reveals its presence. In this revelation, the last vestiges of spiritual pride dissolve completely. There is no one left to be proud of achievements, no sense of having accomplished something special, no identity built around being enlightened or awakened or realized. What remains is utterly ordinary and simultaneously miraculous. Awareness aware of itself, existence experiencing itself, life living itself through the temporary form of what appears to be an individual human being. From this ordinariness comes an extraordinary freedom, the freedom to be completely natural without apology, completely authentic without explanation, completely yourself without justification. You no longer need to maintain any image of how a spiritual person should behave, how an awakened being should respond, how an enlightened individual should live. You can be irritated without spiritual guilt, joyful without spiritual pride, confused without spiritual shame, clear without spiritual superiority. This naturalness becomes your greatest teaching, though you no longer think of yourself as a teacher. Simply by being authentically human, neither inflated nor deflated, neither special nor ordinary, neither above life nor below it, but precisely within it, you demonstrate possibilities that others had forgotten were available. Your very existence becomes a reminder that it is possible to live without pretense, to respond without compulsion, to engage without attachment, to care without clinging. Yet even this teaching function is held lightly, without attachment to outcome or investment in others' responses. If people learn from your presence, wonderful. If they do not, equally wonderful. If they are inspired by your example, beautiful. If they are threatened by it, equally beautiful. All responses are met with the same spacious acceptance, because all responses are recognized as movements within the same consciousness that you are. This recognition extends beyond human interactions to encompass your entire relationship with existence. The silence that has claimed you reveals itself as the silence that holds the stars in their courses, the quietude that allows flowers to bloom, the stillness that permits rivers to flow. You are not separate from this cosmic silence. You are this silence temporarily taking form, briefly appearing as an individual being, momentarily playing the role of a person who has discovered the power of not speaking. But even this cosmic identity is held lightly, without grasping or inflation. You are equally content to be a grain of sand or a galaxy, a moment of confusion or an eternity of clarity, a human being struggling with when to speak or the absolute silence that needs no expression. All identities are recognized as temporary costumes worn by the same eternal awareness. All experiences as waves in the same infinite ocean of being. From this perspective, the entire journey of learning to be silent reveals itself in a new light. It was never about developing a skill or mastering a technique or achieving a spiritual state. It was about gradually dissolving the barriers that prevented you from recognizing what was always already present, the silence that is your deepest nature, the peace that is your original face, the freedom that is your birthright as consciousness itself. The barriers were never real obstacles. They were invitations to go deeper, catalysts for greater surrender, opportunities to discover ever more profound dimensions of what you are. Every compulsion to speak was a doorway into greater stillness. Every struggle with being misunderstood was a gateway to deeper self-acceptance. Every challenge to remain silent was an invitation to trust the intelligence that operates beyond personal understanding. Now, looking back on the path that seemed so difficult, so demanding, so fraught with pitfalls and challenges, you see it with different eyes. Every step was perfect, every struggle necessary, every moment of confusion a perfect teaching moment provided by existence itself for its own awakening through the form of your individual journey. Nothing was wasted, nothing was wrong, nothing could have been different, because everything was orchestrated by an intelligence far beyond what the seeking mind could comprehend. This recognition brings with it a quality of gratitude so profound it seems to emanate from every cell of your being. Gratitude for the provocations that taught you about reaction, for the misunderstandings that revealed your attachment to being seen, for the loneliness that drove you deeper into yourself, for the silence that claimed you completely and revealed itself as what you had always been seeking in all your seeking. But even this gratitude is not something you possess or express. It is something that lives you, breathes you, moves through you as naturally as blood flows through veins. It is not directed toward anything in particular because everything is equally worthy of appreciation, not felt by someone because there is no separate someone left to feel it, not expressed in any specific way because it is the very medium through which all expression arises. From this gratitude emerges a way of being in the world that transforms everything it touches without trying to change anything. Your presence becomes a blessing that asks for nothing in return, a gift that expects no acknowledgement, a service that requires no recognition. Simply by being what you are, consciousness aware of itself as silence, you contribute to the awakening of the whole because you are not separate from the whole. The silence that began as your practice has become existence, practicing itself through you. The stillness that seemed to be your achievement has revealed itself as life achieving itself in you. The peace that appeared to be your attainment has shown itself to be reality attaining itself as you. There is no separation between the seeker and the sought, between the practitioner and the practice, between the one who discovered silence and the silence that was discovered. In this unity, all questions resolve themselves not through answers, but through dissolution. The question of when to speak and when to remain silent disappears because there is no separate someone to make such choices. There is only the appropriate response arising spontaneously from the moment itself. The concern about being misunderstood evaporates because there is no separate identity that could be misunderstood. There is only truth expressing itself in whatever form serves the whole. The fear of being isolated by your silence transforms into the recognition that isolation is impossible. You are not separate from anything, least of all from those who seem not to understand your silence. Their incomprehension is as much a part of the whole as your understanding, their noise as sacred as your quietude, their seeking as perfect as your finding. All of it is the same consciousness exploring itself through infinite forms and expressions. This is perhaps the most radical recognition of all, that nothing needs to be fixed, changed, improved, or transformed. Everything is already perfect exactly as it is, including all the apparent imperfection, all the seeming confusion, all the obvious suffering. The silence that has claimed you does not exist to improve the world, but to recognize the perfection that was always already present, hidden only by the noise of judgment and the chatter of seeking. From this recognition flows a response to life that is simultaneously completely engaged and utterly detached, profoundly caring, and absolutely unattached to outcome, fully present and entirely beyond being affected by what it encounters. You care about everything because you are everything, yet you cling to nothing because you lack nothing. You respond to all needs because you are the source from which all needs arise, yet you are moved by none because you are the stillness in which all movement occurs. This paradoxical way of being cannot be understood by the mind that seeks to grasp and categorize experience. It can only be lived, breathed, embodied, allowed. It is not a philosophy to be believed, but a reality to be inhabited, not a teaching to be learned, but a truth to be lived, not an achievement to be attained, but a recognition of what was never actually absent. And in this living recognition, the silence that seemed to be your personal discovery reveals its ultimate nature. It is not yours at all, but belongs to no one and everyone equally. Not something you found, but something that found you. Not a power you developed, but a truth that developed you into itself until nothing remained, but the truth itself appearing temporarily as what seems to be an individual human being who has learned the power of not speaking. But even this appearance is held lightly, without identification or attachment. You are equally happy to appear as someone who speaks constantly, or someone who never speaks at all, someone who explains everything, or someone who explains nothing, someone who is understood by all, or someone who is understood by none. All appearances are equally valid expressions of the same source, all roles equally sacred costumes worn by the same eternal consciousness. In this ultimate freedom from all identity, including the identity of being someone who has mastered silence, you discover the deepest secret of all, that there was never anything to master, because you were never separate from what you thought you needed to achieve. The silence was never absent, the peace was never lost, the freedom was never bound. All seeking was the play of consciousness seeking itself, all finding the joy of consciousness recognizing itself, all silence, the rest of consciousness in its own true nature. And from that rest, whether words arise or do not arise, whether explanation emerges or mystery remains, whether engagement happens or withdrawal occurs, all is equally the dance of the one appearing as the many, the eternal playing in time, the infinite expressing itself through the finite, the silence that is the source and destination of all speech. celebrating itself in the endless creativity of existence appearing as form. This celebration requires no participants, because everyone is always already participating, needs no recognition, because everything is already recognized, asks for no understanding, because understanding is what it is. It simply is. Pure existence celebrating its own presence. Absolute awareness enjoying its own clarity. Infinite silence delighting in its own fullness that includes all sound, all speech, all explanation, and all mystery, as equally perfect expressions of what can never be captured in words yet is never absent from any word that is spoken or any silence that is maintained. So here you stand at the threshold of a profound recognition that what you took to be a journey toward mastering silence was actually silence mastering you, dissolving every barrier you thought protected your identity until only the vast spaciousness of pure awareness remains. The power you sought in withholding words reveals itself as the power of being so complete that expression and non-expression flow from the same source with equal grace. You are no longer someone who practices silence. You have become the silence itself, temporarily wearing the costume of a human being, playing the role of one who has discovered what was never actually hidden. The strength you found in refusing to react was always your natural state, temporarily obscured by the noise of seeking, but never truly absent, closer than your breath, yet more vast than space itself. In this recognition, every provocation becomes an invitation to rest deeper. Every misunderstanding, a doorway to greater freedom. Every moment when words could have been spoken but weren't, a celebration of the infinite intelligence that knows precisely what serves truth and what serves only the ego's desperate need to be seen. You have learned not just when to speak and when to remain silent, but that both arise from a place so profound that choice itself dissolves into spontaneous appropriateness. This is the Stoic power they don't teach you. Not the rigid control of never speaking, but the fluid wisdom of responding only from the depths of your being, where silence and speech are equally sacred, equally purposeless, equally perfect expressions of what you are beyond all concepts of who you thought you needed to become. In that recognition, the seeking ends exactly where it began, in the simple, extraordinary, utterly ordinary truth of what is always already here, always already whole, always already free,